Well, hello. Welcome to our continuing devotional. Currently, we're in the book of Colossians, and we're in chapter 1 of Colossians, and we're going to be picking it up at the second half, the first full sentence of verse 5, where Paul's continuing his introduction, the things he's grateful for, the things he's heard about this church, and the things he's praying about. And he just talks about their faith in Christ Jesus. He just talked about their love for the fellow saints, and he just talked about the hope they have laid up in heaven for them. He concludes verse 5 by saying this hope and of this gospel and of this word you have heard before in the word of truth, the gospel. Verse 6, which has come to you, as indeed in the whole world it is bearing fruit and increasing, as it also does among you since the day you heard it and understood the grace of God in truth. So he's saying when they heard the gospel, they didn't just hear a minimal aspect of the good news. That when they heard this word, the word of truth, the gospel, they also heard about all components of it, which includes faith in Jesus, which includes love for the fellow saints, which also includes our hope in heaven. You heard all of that, he says in verse 5, in the gospel. And as it's come to you, it's not just limited to you. The gospel works everywhere. The gospel works all over the world. And he says, listen, wherever this news of Jesus Christ, of his salvation, of his lordship, of his atoning death, of his justifying resurrection, of his ascension and his ruling at the right hand of God, whenever that good news is preached, it bears fruit and it increases all over the world, according to verse 6, just as it does among you. One of the things we mistakenly believe is that the very same gospel that changed our lives won't be sufficient to change another person's life. And so we try to make the gospel cool. We try to come up with gimmicks. We try to tell people and speak about other things rather than the good news of Jesus Christ. But I want you to know the gospel is the power of God into salvation, as Paul said in Romans. It still changes life. It bears fruit. It is God's power behind it. It is increasing. And what we should be praying is, Lord, help us be faithful to proclaim the gospel and then prepare hearts not only to hear the gospel, the good news with their ears, but to understand it with their hearts, which is exactly what Paul talks about at the end of verse 6, when he says, since the day you heard it, and they didn't just hear it, but they understood the grace of God in truth. That's something you need to keep in mind. Many people have heard the gospel, sometimes hundreds of times, but that doesn't mean they've understood it in truth. They haven't grasped it in full, which is why we don't just say, you know what, I've already told them the gospel, I'm not going to tell them again. Sometimes we should tell people again and again and again until the Spirit opens up their eyes and they understand the gospel in truth. He goes on in verse 7 to say, just as you learned it from Epaphras, our beloved fellow servant, he is a faithful minister of Christ on your behalf and has made known to us your love in the Spirit. So he says, here's how we know all this. Because remember, they don't know that Paul knows about them, even though they've certainly heard of Paul. He says, we learned about your faith, your love, your hope, your faithfulness from Epaphras, and because he's the one that shared the gospel with you, and he's a faithful minister. He's probably their pastor of Christ on your behalf. He's faithfully praying for them. And he's also shared with Paul and Timothy and the other apostles about their love and their faithfulness and in Christ Jesus. So Paul's basically getting his introduction out of the way. But in doing so, he's saying he's expressing his gratitude for them. And then he goes on in verse 9 to say, and so, because of all these other things, from the day that we heard, we have not ceased to pray for you, asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will and all spiritual wisdom and understanding. And here's what I want you to notice. Paul just got through saying that this is a church of faith. These Christians have faith, they have love, and they have hope. And they understood the gospel in truth. And yet Paul doesn't say, well, you're there, we're done with you, let's move on to somebody else. Paul says, now that you have all these things, we have not ceased to pray for you, asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will and all spiritual wisdom and understanding. So he's saying, you got a good foundation, but let's keep this in mind. People can have a good foundation, but they need to build on that foundation. They need to grow. So Paul says, I want you to be filled, overflowing with the knowledge of God, his will. I want you to have deep spiritual wisdom and understanding. And this is a reminder to us in the Christian life, that we don't simply get saved and then we're done. We're just waiting for our ticket to heaven. We're just waiting until Jesus comes. No, we get saved and then we grow and we become disciples of Jesus Christ. And what that looks like and the importance of knowing God, we'll talk about in our next devotional. Have a blessed day.